Hi everyone, I'm Jonathan Gilmore from the University of Manchester, and I'm one of the co-conveners of the BISA Intervention and Responsibility to Protect working group. And I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar today, jointly organised by the BISA working group and the European Centre for the Responsibility to Protect at the University of Leeds. And it's the first in a series of 3 webinars the working group will be running this autumn. The roundtable today is on the responsibility to protect in a changing world order. And really looking at the shifts that are occurring as we approach the 20th anniversary of the original RtoP report, and also the 10th anniversary of the Libya intervention in 2011. And today's panel springs out of a special issue that's currently being put together for ethics in international affairs. And the panelists are looking at how the RtoP is likely to progress in what seems to be looking like a kind of a post-liberal world order. The RtoP as a concept is very much a product of a period of time, a period of liberal dominance in international relations at the turn of the century. And the theme of today is really, is what the shifts that are currently occurring might mean for the protection of civilians and the prevention of mass atrocity crime in the long run. We've got a really excellent panel with whom to explore this theme. And presenting today we have Adrian Gallagher from the University of Leeds, Nick Wheeler from the University of Birmingham, Christina Steffen from the University of Leeds, my colleague James Pattison from the University of Manchester, Luke Glanville, and joining us later will be Jennifer Welsh, the former Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on the Responsibility to Protect. And the way we're going to work this is the presenters are going to speak for roughly 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll try and open things out into a broader discussion later on. And we'll be running this session today for about 90 minutes and finishing around about 4 o'clock UK time. So without further ado, I'd like to start off and hand over to Adrian and Nick for the first contribution to today's roundtable.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going first. It's great to see so many of you here this afternoon, and we look forward to the discussion that we're going to have. This is a co-authored paper between Adrian, Justin Morris at the University of Hull, and myself, but only Adrian and I are presenting today. Justin sends his apologies. The concept of the responsibility to protect developed out of the failure of the Security Council to act collectively and effectively in the face of mass atrocities in Rwanda and Kosovo. And a key part of the challenge facing the 2001 International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty was to put in place a new normative framework to prevent future collective failures on the part of the Council. As Jennifer will discuss in her talk, the imaginative pathways to legitimate military action in the event that the Council was blocked in the future that were proposed by the ICISS were closed down in the 2005 agreement by heads of state and governments at the UN. Paragraph 139 of the World Summit Outcome document stipulates, of course, that any use of force to prevent or stop mass atrocities must be authorized by the Security Council under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. The starting point for our paper's reflection on RtoP at 20, if we think back, as Jonathan was saying, to the original report and projecting ahead to next year when our special issue will be published, is to consider the future prospects for UN authorized uses of force under the RtoP. The central argument we make is that a key enabling condition of the use of force by the Council is the level of trust that its members have in particular states that are willing to intervene to save endangered humanity. Our argument is that trust and distrust are key variables in Council decisions to use force. And we show this through a case study of the Libyan intervention. We then draw lessons for the future. Whilst accounts of Libya have evidenced a wide range of contextual factors that enabled the intervention, we argue that the role of trust and distrust remains both overlooked and under-theorised. Now, before I hand over to Adrian, who will explore these dynamics of trust and distrust in greater detail, I'd like to offer a few quick thoughts on how we're defining and using trust here. Building on my own work in this area, we define trust as, quote, the expectation of no harm in context where betrayal is always a possibility. Trust is a mental or psychological state that cannot be observed directly, but it enables actions towards others, trusting actions or trusting behaviour, that would not be possible in the absence of this mental state of trust. Now, it's also always important to remember that trust is always given in relation to someone and something. And as a result, it's conceivable that actors might trust another individual or state in relation to one issue area, whilst distrusting the same actor in relation to another issue area. So what then does X look for before placing its trust in Y in relation to Z? Trust researchers identified three key attributes that trusters, those doing the trusting, look for in trustees, those who are being trusted. It's important to keep the concepts of trust and trustworthiness separate, and they're often conflated in the literature, both inside international relations and outside, because individuals only enter a psychological or mental state of trust in relation to another individual or collective if they believe in the current and future trustworthiness of that actor. Classic formulations in the trust literature single out ability or capacity, benevolence, or what I prefer to talk about as peaceful intent in relation to international relations, and integrity, the so-called ABI model made famous by Mayer et al. In their widely cited 1995 article. Now, we define distrust as an active belief that another actor cannot be trusted. Distrust provides a cognitive and effective map for managing uncertainty. In that sense, it's the functional equivalent of trust, in that both trust and distrust manage uncertainty, and they do so by substituting the anxieties that uncertainty generates with certainties. Those certainties, of course, are always subjectively held, either about the peaceful intentions of another, trust, or malign, distrust. Now, what we do in the paper is that we add to this conceptual framework by exploring what we call the space between trust and distrust. This is important because the absence of trust does not necessarily mean the existence of distrust. Here, we import into international relations Margolit's term of, quote, a neutral state, where actors neither trust nor distrust. We think this is a really fruitful idea, and as Adrian will explore further, we use this category to explain the 5 abstentions in the Council on the military intervention in Libya. We develop all of these points in greater depth in the paper, and I'll now hand over to Adrian to take us through the case and the implications of our trust-based theory for future UN authorised military intervention under the RtoP. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. So as Nick touched upon there, essentially we have a problem with how the crisis in Libya is portrayed in the literature. It's often framed as a binary between trust at the time of the intervention and distrust in the aftermath of the intervention, which we find problematic for 2 reasons. The first is that it overstates the level of trust at the time. Obviously, there were 5 states that abstained, and we propose that these 5 abstainers neither trusted nor distrusted the P3, but acted as neutral states. So the P2 of Russia and China could, if they had trusted the P3, then surely they would have voted in favour. If they had distrusted the P3, they did have opportunities to veto the resolution. With regards to Brazil, India and Germany, they certainly had reservations, but we evidence this in the paper, the statements made were about strategy. They did not question the ability, benevolence and integrity of the P3 themselves. So essentially these 5 countries end up being neutral abstainers in this neutral space between trust and distrust. The second problem that we have with the binary of trust and distrust is that the 7 states that voted in favour of the P3 taking action made clear the bounded limits of their trust. So in the paper we have statements from South Africa, Nigeria, Colombia, etc., but they are clearly exerting limitations, caveats, and therefore, if we present Libya as kind of an era of trust, we overstate the level of trust that even these 7 states had, as this was a bounded trust. And these 2 things, how we categorise Libya and understand this, have implications for going forward, which we'll come on to below. So what went wrong in Libya? What we're interested in here is the backlash from the BRICS embodies both these trusting authorisers, South Africa, and the neutral abstainers of Brazil, Russia, India and China. And we propose that the behaviour of the P3 fuelled this distrust. So here, for those familiar with the literature, we would favour the sort of Ralph Gifkin's interpretation of post-Libya, as opposed to the Puleo and Adler-Nissen interpretation of post-authorisation Libya. We believe that the P3 acted with A, a sense of superiority, B, failed to have any serious debate over regime change, and C, at times refused to answer legitimate questions. Now, to go back to trust, what's interesting here is face-to-face interactions, because face-to-face interactions can provide a rich zone of information to a person's trustworthiness. So we propose that if the P3 had answered questions and debated regime change, then whether they won the debate or not, this could have helped them maintain a perception of integrity. So here we believe and agree with Bellamy and McLaughlin's point that the lack of accountability fuels distrust, and that the behaviour of the P3 from a trust perspective helps us make sense of this. So going forward and conscious of time, we agree that it's highly unlikely that the P5 will authorise the use of force anytime soon. But before we accept the RtoP is dead, we should also recall that no one expected the use of force in Libya. But a few take-home points: the trust-distrust binary that's common in the literature suggests that in order to have any such use of force in the future, the pendulum needs to swing from distrust to trust. But evidently that was not the case in Libya, as essentially the right mix of bounded trust and neutral abstainers would be enough in the future. But the second point, we would argue that the potential for use of force in the future remains dependent not just on this constellation of factors that's often documented with regards to Libya, but also a workable level of trust. And for that to happen, you will need no clash of interests between the great powers over the case in question. You'll need no distrust between the P5 on the specific issue area, and an absence of distrust amongst the rest of the E10, which does highlight just the challenge ahead and just how unlikely it is to happen. We also think that there needs to be more accountability, and we think the RtoP proposed at the time was a complementary move in the right direction. And fortunately, Cristina is going to talk about that next because we don't have time. But overall, if states cannot build trust around the use of force under Pillar 3, then Pillar 3 is in serious trouble, because essentially if we take this tool out of the toolbox, the other tools may become blunt. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. Immaculately to time. And that's actually a very nice segue into Christina's contribution now. So, Christina Steffen. Christina, you ready? You might be on mute, Christina.
Oh, sorry, I was just talking to myself. Yes, apologies. Thank you. So, anniversaries provide important opportunities to pause and reflect on progress and to take stock in terms of what worked, what hasn't worked, problematic episodes like NATO's intervention in Libya, which Nick and Adrian mentioned, with the goal to adjust as necessary in order to do better in the future. And of course, we have important anniversaries this year, 2020 marking special anniversary for the United Nations, 75 years from the signing of the UN Charter. 2020 also marks 15 years since the adoption of the responsibility to protect principle at the United Nations. And also September 2020 marks exactly 20 years since the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, the ad hoc commission, which produced the responsibility to protect report, was set up by the government of Canada in an initiative pointing to one of the first RtoP norm entrepreneurs. So my contribution to the special issue focuses on the agency of these norm entrepreneurs with enough drive and resources to keep the responsibility to protect on the international agenda in a changing world order, with the emphasis on the changing aspect. So I briefly go over a few key examples of norm entrepreneurship in the 15 years since the responsibility to protect was adopted by the UN in the World Summit Outcome document. And then I asked whether we should still expect countries from the global north, including middle powers like Canada and some key supporters from the European Union who had previously been acting as a dispensable norm entrepreneurs. Those countries traditionally engage in promoting human rights. Should we still expect them to lift up the RtoP framework once again, or whether we need to look at norm entrepreneurship from the global south more, countries like Brazil and Guatemala, for instance, that exerted norm entrepreneurship and leadership in the past to further advance RtoP going forward. So I'll very briefly go over some important examples of norm entrepreneurship from both the global north and the global south. And I need to start with the Independent Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, which coined the term the responsibility to protect. This was, as we all know, the title of their report released in 2001. And indeed, the commission was set up by the government of Canada, so a Western example of norm entrepreneurship, but it was set up as an independent commission with a balanced composition of members drawn from all regions of the world. And global consultations informed the final responsibility to protect report. And in fact, the commission's two co-chairs and editors of the responsibility to protect report, Gareth Evans, the Australian diplomat, and Mohamed Sanoun, the late Algerian diplomat, meant to reflect precisely this balance. And it's also very important to remember, and I want to mention it here, the work of the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty built on existing ideas, particularly ideas coming from the African continent, which was in no small part the result of an amazing display of individual leadership and entrepreneurship on the part of African diplomats. And I can say a few words about individual Norm entrepreneurship later if we have time, because it was significant indeed. And Mohamed Sanoun, for instance, one of the two co-chairs of the International Commission, during dialogues with his friend Salim Ahmed Salim, the former head of the Organization of African Unity, exchanged ideas around the switch from non-intervention to non-indifference in what was back then the new constitutive act of the new African Union. And Sanoun himself described the responsibility to protect as an African contribution to human rights. So, of course, the RtoP conceptually captures another notion coined by the South Sudanese diplomat and scholar Francis Deng, namely the notion of sovereignty as responsibility. Countries like South Africa, Rwanda also played a significant role in advancing the responsibility to protect agenda during those really tense negotiations prior to the 2005 adoption of RtoP in the World Summit outcome documents. 4 years later, still at the United Nations, another country from the global south, Guatemala, introduced the first UN General Assembly resolution on RtoP, co-sponsored by 67 states and adopted 11 years ago, September 2009. Quite an important example of non-Western norm entrepreneurship comes from Brazil in regards to their responsibility while protecting initiative, which is so well known now that we use it through the acronym RtoP. And this was meant to reshape and clarify the responsibility to protect framework, and in particular its most controversial component, the use of force, what that should entail. And as Nick and Adrian mentioned, this was obviously in relation to the intervention in Libya. And in the very tense diplomatic environment resulting from the implementation of Resolution 1973, Brazil decided to introduce this set of considerations on how using force should not be making matters worse. And they circulated a paper to the Security Council membership in November 2011 by then a Brazilian permanent representative with a set of prescriptions, which included an emphasis on prevention, but also developing Security Council procedures to monitor and assess the manner in which resolutions are interpreted and implemented. And here again, as with other RtoP non-entrepreneurship initiatives, individual leadership was key in this case. Ambassador Antonio Patriota, who was the foreign minister at that time, later from the representative to the UN, played a key role. So in the context of a changing world order, norm entrepreneurship from the global south, from non-Western countries becomes particularly important as it solidifies the understanding of the responsibility to protect framework and the implementation of the responsibility to protect, not as a Western concept as it is often criticized and as it was criticized in the aftermath of Libya. One example of leadership in this sense. The Gambia, of course, on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, filed a case against Myanmar at the International Court of Justice, alleging genocide against the Rohingyas. So this is to highlight some initiatives from the Global South. And a recent example of a valuable non-Western norm entrepreneurship comes from Egypt, and it's made stronger by the fact that it was introduced during the Aswan Forum and designed for the African Union to engage with this Egyptian proposal at the regional level. And this initiative argues basically that the atrocity prevention agenda, when it's nationally owned, becomes what the Egyptians have called sovereignty enhancer. So in this particular example, Egypt proposed the notion that prevention should be seen as a sovereignty enhancer rather than a threat to sovereignty, which relates, of course, to the point made by the current, by the UN Secretary General Guterres and by the Peace Building Support Office at the UN, under the orientation of the Assistant Secretary General Oscar Taranco. And this appeared in the text prepared for the Aswan Forum, which the Egyptian government organized last December during their presidency of the African Union. And the basic idea behind this initiative was that if prevention is approached from this angle, it can help to reduce the interventionist impulse still in the minds of some, which is so detrimental to the credibility of the responsibility to protect. So in this example, the Egyptian proposal clarified how responsibilities for atrocity prevention and protection value both the vulnerable populations and state sovereignty, which is really dear to non-Western countries. Norm entrepreneurship, leadership can still occur within the UN setting outside the UN Security Council or the General Assembly. And in one recent example is the Human Rights Council, which adopted its first thematic resolution on the responsibility to protect in July, 2 months ago, entitled 50th anniversary of the responsibility to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Something we could add to the anniversary list, which is getting longer. But this was the result of hard work and really intensive efforts to advance the responsibility to protect agenda from countries from the Global South, in the group of, very active in the group of friends of RtoP, which include Costa Rica, countries like Morocco, Qatar, and Peru. So this example shows that the Human Rights Council can create a space when there's enough effort and initiative from key countries to consolidate basically the role of the UN Human Rights Council in advancing the RtoP framework. And there's a recent article, a good article by Elizabeth Framendorfer in the Global RtoP Journal on this. The last point I would mention relates to trends.
Christina, can you start wrapping up, please? Cheers.
Yes, very quickly. So it's one thing the norm entrepreneurs do now is link the responsibility to protect framework of protection and prevention to other global commitments and priorities, which includes the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And this is something that's encouraged in the very timely annual report, the anniversary report of the UN Secretary General on RtoP this year, which talks precisely about bringing important global agendas together. So yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christina. Thank you. Now moving on to James Pattison and Luke Glanville. Ooh, James has got some PowerPoint, super. All yours, James.
Yeah, great. Okay, just give me a second. Okay, apologies, everyone. Two things. Firstly, it's only me talking today because Luke's over in Australia and he's got a brand new baby. He has to be very quiet. So apologies, just got me. And secondly, apologies because you're the guinea pigs. So you're the first time I've tried out using this green screen with PowerPoint behind me. So it doesn't work brilliantly. I know what to do when I go back teaching next week or the week after. Okay, let's get started. So our paper is on what we've called Where to Protect, Prioritization and Responsibility to Protect. It's part of a larger project that we're planning on how states should prioritize global responsibilities. When they can't do everything, what should they focus on? So mass atrocities, conflict prevention, counter-terror, global health. And today we want to do two things. The first is to defend the importance of questions of where to protect for the RtoP in particular, and the second is to highlight some of the central issues involved in what we call prioritization. So to start with, despite the rich and extensive literature on the RtoP and on global responsibilities and international ethics more generally, most accounts focus on single crises. So for instance, is it justifiable to intervene in response to Kosovo, to Libya, to Syria, and so on? And who should intervene in response to Kosovo, in response to Libya, Syria, what are the best means of doing so, how can we prevent crises in other places, so on and so forth. But little attention has been given to how states and other actors should act when they are faced with multiple ongoing and potential mass atrocity situations. So the Global Centre for the RtoP currently identifies 18 populations at risk of mass atrocities. If it's not possible to tackle all of these crises fully, how should states and other actors prioritize amongst them? In other words, where should they protect? This links to the selectivity objection to humanitarian intervention, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, which was often made against humanitarian intervention during the 1990s and 2000s. So if you're not intervening in everywhere, then you're acting selectively or inconsistently, and this is morally problematic. Now, there are two major objections to the selectivity objection in literature. First, different cases warrant different responses. So although intervention might have been justified in Kosovo, it wouldn't have been justified in response to, say, Chechnya. In such instances, selectivity is in fact morally required. Second, the perfect should not be the enemy of the good. Just because one doesn't intervene everywhere, where there are mass atrocities, doesn't mean that it's wrong to intervene somewhere. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this debate. Now, this takes a lot of the force out of the selectivity objection, but it still does seem to have some purchase. And this is to do with the questions of prioritization that we want to look at. It seems that if states choose to tackle the less serious or more risky case where they can't do much to tackle the crisis over other ones, where they could potentially do more, the decision to act appears selective and problematic. So, for instance, why focus on responding forcibly to the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons in Syria, but do little to address the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya? Now, if the international community is responding robustly and effectively to all mass atrocity situations, then questions of prioritization seem somewhat less pressing. So if there are what Bellamy and Luck have called recently in their book, the habits of protection, then crises will receive at least some response. But even if there is still some sort of response, states still have to decide where to send their best resources or most resources, so their best diplomats, the greatest financial input, direct their greatest effort. So our point is that prioritization is something that's happening and is necessary, and some prioritization decisions we think are going to be more justifiable than others. Now, linking this to the themes of the special issue that we're going to be involved in a potential post-liberal order, we think the questions of prioritisation are likely to become even more pressing. This is because there will be fewer states, even than now, willing to react to mass atrocity crises and to fulfil global responsibilities more generally, as states face significant financial pressures, ideas and notions of global responsibilities are played down, and the financial pressures might be exacerbated even more after the current pandemic. And in some of the scenarios predicted by scholars, such as Mearsheimer, but also some of the others, there could be many more mass atrocity situations due to increasing nationalism, heightened border restrictions, and decreasing multilateralism. Okay, so we think questions of prioritisation are important, and particularly for the RtoP. So how then should we go about considering where to protect? Where should states protect? Now, one pretty straightforward answer to this comes from the literature on medical ethics, and to a certain extent the effective altruism movement, if you're familiar with it. And it's what we call the basic maximization model. And this requires states to prioritize atrocities where they seem likely to be able to save the greatest number of lives, or perhaps in terms of medical ethics, the largest number of quality adjusted life years, so QALYs for short. What this would involve is considering the severity of the atrocities, the likelihood of making a positive impact, the potential magnitude of any positive impact, so how many lives you would save, and the potential costs involved. Now, we think that this is a valuable starting point, don't get us wrong, but we think it's incomplete. So this has got to be part of the answer, but we don't think it's going to be the full answer. So there are other considerations that aren't easily captured by this basic maximization. And here we think it makes sense to, helps to distinguish between what we call atrocity-specific considerations and response-specific considerations. So atrocity-specific considerations concern the features of mass atrocities. The basic maximization model reflects one atrocity-specific consideration: how serious the situation, how serious the crisis is, how many lives have been lost. But there are others, such as the urgency of the situation. For instance, is it more important to tackle an urgent crisis where there is a response is required, or a situation where larger numbers of people may die, but they will do so over a longer period of time? So you can either urgent situation or a more slow burning one, where more people are going to die. Which one should we tackle? Another is moral responsibility. Should you focus on crises that you've been responsible for causing? So for instance, should those that invaded Iraq in 2003 prioritize responding to mass atrocities in the Middle East rather than elsewhere where they might have been less culpable? Now, response considerations, specific considerations, differ from this, and they concern the features of the responses to mass atrocities. So the features of intervention, sanctions, diplomacy, non-violence, all the other measures that you might engage in. Now, the most likely response, most obvious response-specific consideration is the effectiveness of the measure. And this, as I've already said, is captured by the basic maximization model. But again, there are others, and particularly non-instrumental considerations that are missed on this model. For instance, does the potential for military intervention and economic sanctions to do harm to innocents directly mean that they should be disfavored? And this would go against the distinction made by moral philosophers between doing and allowing harm, where they say that doing harm is worse than allowing harm. Also relevant are some of the broader effects of a particular response, such as whether it risks undermining the consensus on RtoP, which could impede the protection of other lives in the future, such as some perceived was in the case in the aftermath of the action in Libya. Okay, so that's one way of making some headway with the question. Another way, we think, is to distinguish between three types of prioritization dilemma. And these relate to the different domains of engagement with mass atrocity: prevention, response, we're all familiar with, and what we call, the third one is what we call amelioration. And amelioration involves, rather than attempting to tackle or prevent crises, it's ameliorating some of their negative effects, for instance, by delivering humanitarian aid or accepting refugees. So there are three domains: response, prevention, and amelioration. And these lead to three sorts of prioritization dilemmas. The first dilemma involves prioritization decisions within each of the particular domains. So take reaction. How should states weigh the need to devote resources to react to ongoing atrocities in Cameroon against the need to react to ongoing atrocities in Myanmar? The second dilemma cuts across the three domains. For instance, it might involve weighing the deployment of peacekeepers to prevent mass atrocities in the Central African Republic against a large-scale diplomatic effort to react to ongoing atrocities in Mali. So in other words, it would compare reaction with prevention, or prevention with amelioration, and so on and so forth. Now, the third is probably the most tricky, and this involves dilemmas beyond the RtoP. It concerns assessing how the responsibilities to prevent, react to, and to ameliorate mass atrocities ought to be weighed against other global responsibilities. And these concern things such as tackling global poverty, global health, and climate change. For instance, would the diplomatic and economic effort made to address mass atrocities in Syria being better used to promote global health, such as by resourcing efforts to combat malaria? Okay, so what does this all mean in practice? So we don't really have a very strong answer just yet because it's the start of a new project. We've got a few tentative thoughts that we hope to build on in the future. So firstly, reactive measures, particularly those that are most coercive, sanctions, military intervention, are often treated as the default response. But they often have high risks and high costs, can undermine political consensus, and are limited in effectiveness at saving lives, and also can involve doing harm. So on the atrocity response considerations and the atrocity-specific considerations and the response-specific considerations, they might actually be the best. It might be better to prioritize other crises, such as situations that might require more non-coercive, more effective, and less and measures that are less likely to do harm than these sorts of responses. Second, related, humanitarian intervention in assisting refugees can typically save many more lives more cheaply and with lower risk of doing harm and exacerbating the suffering than is the case with reactive responses. So crises where these sorts of responses are feasible should be the priority. Third, beyond RtoP, the need to tackle situations of poor global health and global poverty is often more pressing than tackling mass atrocities. This is given the sheer number of lives at stake from preventable disease and impoverishment and the magnitude of the impact that measures to address disease and poverty can provide. So although atrocity response is, we think, a very valuable goal, at other times it might be better to prioritize resources elsewhere. Okay, final caveat, and then I'm done. These suggestions that we've briefly outlined concerns how states should ideally prioritize if they were to do what they really ought to do in a more ideal world. But decision makers might be hamstrung by parliaments that refuse to endorse spending on the most optimal measures, or by international organizations that just won't authorize the appropriate action, the most optimal action. These constraints, we think, could be further exacerbated in the post-liberal order. In such cases, it's better, as those responding to the selectivity objection argue, to do something rather than nothing. In other words, in certain cases, suboptimal prioritization might be permissible where there's very little else that could be done. Notwithstanding, if the failure to optimally prioritize is due simply to the lack of imagination or the lack of unwillingness on behalf of states and the decision makers, which we think it often is, then states should rightly be criticized for protecting non-ideally. So although doing something is better than nothing, decision makers should, wherever possibly, we think, take seriously their responsibility to consider where to protect. Thank you. Okay.
Excellent, thank you, James. Brilliant. Our final paper for this roundtable, our final contribution to this roundtable is from Jennifer Welsh. So Jennifer, all yours. Oh, Jennifer, I think you're on mute.
You'd think by now I wouldn't make that mistake. I've been doing this for months and months. Sorry about that. Thanks very much for having me as part of this panel to reflect on 20 years of the ICISS report, or as we all say in our presentations, ICIS is the short form. What my paper is on is the Security Council's role in fulfilling the responsibility to protect. So in reflecting on both the ways in which it's acted and failed to act in fulfilling its responsibility, and in particular, how its record has shaped implementation and perceptions of responsibility to protect. And the starting point for the discussion in my paper is the observation that despite both the efforts of those who've been most active in shaping the conceptual evolution of RtoP, including ICIS, scholars, actors in the UN Secretariat, etc., and the concrete and multiple ways in which a broad conception of the RtoP has been implemented, many, indeed most observers continue to concentrate almost exclusively on the Council when they're evaluating what RtoP has or hasn't achieved. Of course, it's only one institution among many actors with the responsibility and capacity to protect, but its prominent position's undeniable, even if some might argue that this is regrettable. And there are two main reasons for that, which might seem obvious, but I think they're important to state, and I do in the paper. The first is that the Council is designated in the Charter, one of the most authoritative multilateral treaties we have, as the body with particular responsibilities for peace and security. And it's also designated with the power to make resolutions that are binding upon states. It also has the capacity to be a forum for two critical processes in contemporary IR: the mitigation or management or mediation, if you will, of great power rivalry, and the facilitator of great power cooperation, and secondly, a site for norm and policy development. Now, of course, whether it plays these two roles or not is another empirical question, but that's its potential. And the second point is that the Council is one setting, and an important one, for the operation of multilateralism. And one of the things I want to do in the paper is try to reflect on the principles underpinning multilateralism. So as a legitimating process, multilateralism expresses two key values of procedural justice that are foundational to modern international society. Chris Ray-Smith refers to these as self-legislation and non-discrimination. States as sovereign equals or peers participate actively in the creation of the rules to which they are subject. And secondly, in the process, they ensure that rules apply equally to all and that the potential for power asymmetries and particular national interests to dominate is minimized. And the Council theoretically enables both of those to work, albeit among a specific set of states in deliberations around the collective use of coercive tools. So when the Council authorizes coercive measures, it's meant to reflect these principles of multilateralism, thus providing an important source of legitimacy. And so the ICIS commissioners state in their report, collective intervention blessed by the Council is regarded as legitimate because it is duly authorized by a representative international body. Unilateral intervention as seen as illegitimate because self-interested. Now, with respect to the responsibility to react, ICIS clearly allocated the Council a particular and leading role. It claimed that there was no better or more appropriate body to authorize military action. It stipulated that the core task was not to find alternatives to the Council, but to make it work better. And it insisted that those calling for interventions should formally request authorization, have the Council raise the issue under its own initiative, or have the Secretary General raise it under Article 99. And of course, finally, it insisted that the Council should act promptly and decisively. But the commissioners coupled those prescriptive statements with two other important points about the UN and the Council as the authoritative holder of the collective responsibility to protect. First, it reminded states that while it was crucial in order for the UN to function effectively as a law-enforcing collective security organization, that states renounce the unilateral use of force. The corollary to that, and this tends to be forgotten, is that states should be willing to use force on behalf of, as directed by, and for the goals of the UN. In other words, states ultimately must operationalize the UN's authority. And as we know from Nick and Adrian's paper in the case of Libya, it was this translation of the UN's authority that led to such intense contestation over the use of force in this case. The second thing ICAS did was reflected explicitly and in retrospect somewhat boldly on how we should think about situations in which the Council could not or would not respond in a timely and decisive way. And I'll come back to these in just a couple of seconds. Now, I don't need to elaborate in great detail how the 2005 endorsement of RtoP differed from the ICAS formulation. But I just want to make a couple of points here, and which I will elaborate on in the paper. First, and I think this is something that tends to get overshadowed, is that the principle appeared in the section of the outcome document that talks about human rights, not under discussions of collective security. And this already suggests, I think, an aversion on the part of many member states to consider intervention for human protection purposes as part of the UN's standard practice of collective security. Second, and many of us have written about this, the version of RtoP that was accepted was one that was framed as a principle that was non-transformational, that was consistent with existing procedures of decision-making and prevailing conceptions of threats to international peace and security. So in particular, partly as a result of misgivings about legalizing any new responsibility, the coercive elements of RtoP are firmly embedded in the collective security provisions of the Charter. So against the wishes of opponents like Pakistan, Syria, Egypt, and Iran, Article 139 explicitly mentions Chapter 7. But on the other hand, for those states concerned to enshrine the responsibility to protect in the summit outcome document, the principle would have lacked teeth without this link to enforcement by the Council. So I think Michael Doyle puts it best when he says that RtoP, as per the summit outcome document, is both a license for and a leash against forcible intervention. The more interesting question to me is why many other states agreed to this continuation of great power privilege. Members of the non-aligned grouping of states, for example, pressed during the negotiation for greater recognition of the GA's role, even if subsidiary to that of the Council. And for its part, African Union states wanted language that would enable the AU to act first and secure Security Council approval later. But Article 139 represented a compromise that would address what was seen as two greater problems: the possibility that Western states might use force unilaterally outside the structure of the UN, well known, but also the possibility that an atrocity crime situation itself would automatically trigger military action. The text of the summit outcome document ensures that each crisis will be addressed anew by a multilateral procedure with no a priori commitment to act. So the text was pulling back from the boldness of the ICAS report, certainly in terms of its willingness to entertain alternatives should there be a failure by the P5 to act. So I think in sum, and Murty and Kurtz have put this rather nicely, the summit outcome document embraces not coercive solidarism, but rather consensual solidarism, based on a traditional understanding of international law and multilateralism as being created by equal sovereigns. And so the text is neither the revolution hailed by some of RtoP's strongest advocates, nor some ominous overreach of supranational authority that's emphasized by some of RtoP's fiercest critics. And I elaborate on this in the paper. So in light of this articulation and the 15 years of practice since, I go on in the paper to make two more specific arguments about how the ICAS report conceives of the Council's role with respect to RtoP and how it looks 20 years on. And I'll just sketch these out very, very briefly in the time I have. First, I think the original ICAS report now appears too minimalist in its explication of the responsibilities of the Council, limiting its function to the authorization of coercive means to address crises of human protection. We've seen in the last 2 decades the Council engaging in other ways by enabling political and humanitarian efforts in particular crises, but also by shaping important discourses and expectations about how state responsibilities for protection should be achieved. We can think here of Côte d'Ivoire, Burundi, Syria, and other cases. And a lot of these efforts are well captured by Alex Bellamy's idea of the peaceful means of Pillar 3. But it's also important to mention in this context the ways in which the Council, through its authorization of peace operations that operate with the consent of host states, has mandated a number of missions with robust protection mandates, particularly in the DRC and CAR. My second argument in the paper is that the Commissioner's willingness to identify potential alternatives to the Council is much more relevant today and indeed urgent in our current environment of geopolitical breakdown, in the geopolitical rivalry and breakdown in the functioning of the Council. When we consider the past 3 to 4 years of the Council's performance, the absence of any discussion, let alone action on Myanmar, its abject failure for months in agreeing on any statement addressing the COVID pandemic, its failure to agree to support renewal of cross-border delivery of humanitarian assistance in Syria, and its general descent into a forum for Sino-US rivalry, it's clear that we're in the midst of that very grave danger of delegitimization that the ICAS report talks about. And so in the last part of the paper, I look at some of the Commission's ideas, but also others for how to think differently about ways of exercising the collective responsibility to protect or alter the practices of the Security Council. In terms of ICAS, I don't so much talk about ideas for restraint on the use of the veto, which have been discussed at length by others, but more the Uniting for Peace procedure. But I also introduce 2 other ideas which have been discussed and which I shine a little bit more attention on. And that's the idea of the creation of a UN Parliamentary Assembly. And secondly, an increase in the powers of the SG and the GA to propose policy to the Council, and a possible limitation of the Council's role in actual authorization. But above all, I want to use the occasion of reflection on 20 years of the ICAS report as an opportunity to highlight the consequences and indeed the costs of the 2005 Summit Outcome Document's particular formulation of RtoP, which limited the ways in which collective measures could be legitimately pursued when national authorities are manifestly failing. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you. Thanks to all the participants. Some really, really interesting contributions there, and some quite interesting sort of cross-cutting themes, I think, that are becoming evident. I mean, the the issue of the relations within the UN Security Council and the role of this UN Security Council as a decision-making framework, and the problem of developing trust within the Security Council seems very significant given the current geopolitical situation and rivalries between the great powers. And also the role that may come to be played by non-Western states in relation to the RtoP in an increasingly post-liberal international order. And also, one thing I find quite interesting from some of those is perhaps the limited ambitions or limited capabilities of states that have historically been some of the strongest supporters of the RtoP. Whether it may not be both a question of political will, but also simply a question of capability, particularly in a post-COVID world, in a world that's likely to be affected by economic turmoil for a little bit yet. What I'd like to do is really to open it out to questions, contributions from those of you who have been listening very patiently. We've got a really good forum for this in a sense, because you can put your hand up and ask a question verbally. There's also the chat function if you just want to include an aside or a smaller point. So please either use the raising hand function. So if you click on participants and look at the participant list, there's an option to raise your hand, or you can include a question in the chat section. Give me a second, I'm just going to see if anyone's got their hands up just now. I think there's an initial contribution from Ed here. Ted. Don't know if Nick or Adrian, once they've had a chance to read it, would like to respond to Ted's question in the chat here.
It's quite a long statement. I guess it may have been better if Ted had just spoken and framed it. But I guess just if we can illustrate what we're talking about with two quotes. So essentially, if you take the portrayal of Libya, for example, by Simon Adams and Michael Doyle, Adams claims, quote, deep breach of trust between states leading up to the intervention, which then saw the RtoP as being hijacked and compromised. Michael Doyle argued that the breakdown of trust over Libya had impacted negatively on the Council, responding effectively to humanitarian catastrophe in Syria, and, quote, trust in Pillar 3 enforcement of the RtoP by the Security Council in controversial cases has been eroded. And we've got some other references in the article, but what we're saying is that we don't think it's all about trust over Libya, but what we see in the literature is fleeting references to trust. And when these are used, these reflect a binary. They're suggesting that Libya was in some way an area of trust, and then post-authorization, the emergence of distrust. And what we're saying is that it's essentially inaccurate because A, there wasn't the level of trust there. So on that aspect, I think we're agreeing with Ted, because the states that agreed voted in favour, it was bounded trust, and the states that abstained were neutral, in a state of neutrality between trust and distrust. And that has implications for going forward, as we discussed in the paper. Thanks.
Thanks, Adrian.
Yeah, I think just to follow up there a little bit, I think one of the key claims we're making is that trust can be an enabling condition of intervention. That we've got all these contextual factors that are often listed to explain the Libyan intervention, but actually what is, in a sense, I think the real puzzle of the Libyan case is how it is that 7 states on the Security Council came to vote for an intervention. And in a sense, picking up Jennifer's point, what makes the Council authorization so striking, I think, in 2011, is that this wasn't an intervention that was launched after thousands and thousands of people had been killed, let alone hundreds of thousands of people. This was an intervention that was launched in the belief that it would prevent an impending massacre. And the idea that 7 states on the Security Council from the E10 were willing to sign up to that suggests that there was a strong level of trust, but very much bounded in the mandate as laid down by the P3 and then adopted by the Council. So I think that's what is, and then the reason why the trust-distrust binary doesn't work is also because it misses the fact that the abstaining states neither trusted nor distrusted. Now, there's a fascinating counterfactual. What would have happened if Vladimir Putin had been the Russian leader at the time? Would the Russians have vetoed it? Putin was very quick to condemn Medvedev as being started during the implementation phase, and to say that this confirmed all of his distrust of the West. But when the Russians cast their vote in the Council, what we want to argue is that they neither trusted nor distrusted. And that might be that particular moment in US-Russian relations, that possibility of cooperation that Medvedev opened up with Obama, which is important to understand in this case. But it doesn't take away from the fact that those abstentions don't really fit the trust or distrust. There's something else going on. And it's that really interesting space in between that we try to open up in the paper.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Adrian. Jennifer, I think you've got your hand up here.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in. I haven't read their paper yet, but to give you to another possible response to Ed's question. It might be useful, not. But there's another way it seems to me that trust was interesting in that case. And that was from an operational point of view. So given that this was the first time you'd had a mission authorized for civilian protection purposes explicitly by the Council, as opposed to a peace operation, you didn't have the mechanisms for sunset clauses or mandate renewal. And effectively, what many have said is the P3 said, trust us to execute this militarily in observation of IHL. Like, trust us, we will do this. And literally that notion of trust us, we don't have to go through the kinds of mechanisms that we have for peace operations of oversight. You can trust us to execute this mission, right? And so in a sense, it was very central to that initial discussion. And of course, that's what broke down. I mean, I would argue, you never want to say never. That will never happen again, right? It will never, those countries operating under NATO will never be able to say, trust us to do this without any form of oversight, right? So there's another way in which it comes in that might be interesting for you to play with. Maybe you already do. But it seems to me that that kind of framework, which maybe is a bit too binary for what you want to do, was certainly operating.
Nick, Adrian, do you want to respond to that at all?
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, Jennifer, don't you think it's interesting, though, that of the 7 that voted in favour of Resolution 1973, only South Africa comes out and really, comes out in a very strong condemnatory way, whereas the other 6, I mean, what I find really striking going back to this case is how much the other 6 stay on board when the P3 strategy shifts towards regime change. Now, is that because these council members are persuaded that ultimately the only way to provide for humanitarian protection in Libya is to undertake regime change? Or is it? I mean, it seems to me that there's a really good question here. Why don't they join? Why don't a number of those states join with South Africa? Why do they support NATO's implementation, P3's implementation? And of course, of the abstaining states, this is when the responsibility whilst protecting, coming back to Christina's discussion, this of course is where the Brazilians then really push this argument in the council, because they feel, so what you end up with is you end up with the neutral abstainers moving to a position of distrust, but only being joined then by South Africa. I mean, that's our reading of the way in which the council politics played out. I mean, I think it's really interesting now to kind of think about it, going back to it and trying to make sense of it through this prism of trust, which I do think, you know, and all credit to Adrian for suggesting that we tried to bring together the ideas of trust research and RtoP, which for me, of course, is bringing together agendas that I've been working with for a long time, to try and open up thinking about the Security Council in this way.
Thanks, Nick. Anyone else like to make a contribution? Please put your hand up or just drop a message in here. Otherwise, I'm gonna drop one in myself here. It's to James and Luke. You're putting together this kind of framework for the prioritization response, making decisions to intervene or to respond in certain cases and not in others. I wondered, within your framework that you're trying to develop here, where national interest sits here, whether there was any room for national interest. If we think about populist politics, we're seeing a sort of a refocusing on the national interests of the state and a sort of arguably a kind of a movement away from ideas of moral responsibility across state borders. Is it morally legitimate is national interest a kind of a morally legitimate factor to consider when prioritising responses? Is it like, I mean, it's likely that states will tend to intervene more when they consider it to be strongly in their national interest than when they don't. So just where does that sit within your kind of framework of prioritisation?
Okay, thanks, Johnny. Right, so I think it fits in two places. So we plan to develop a two-level model of prioritisation, which is on the one hand ideal, on the other hand non-ideal. So ideally, national interest might have some role to play to think ideally how states ought to prioritise. This depends on how much you're a statist versus a cosmopolitan. My leanings are more towards the cosmopolitan side, so I don't think that national interest is that morally important. But I mean, this is a moot question. It still does seem that states should be concerned to some extent with the national interest. Now, non-ideally, it might factor more. And this is because of the constraints that states are likely to face decision makers. It's going to be very difficult for them sometimes to go anything feasible that significantly contravenes the national interest. So prioritization decisions can still be justifiable even when they are undertaken within the national interest. A lot depends on the exact details of how much that national interest is actually constraining the decision and how much choice the decision makers have got to be able to override it. So does that answer the question? So it's in two ways. Ideally, maybe a bit, non-ideally, probably a bit more.
Okay, yeah, that's fine, thank you. Cheers. Christina, sorry, did you have I think you raised your hand on the camera.
Well, I was trying, I'm sorry, I only see the reactions, one with the thumbs up and thumbs down. So
it's in the participants section. If you click on participants, it brings up a list and the raise hand.
Yeah,
no
apologies. So it basically relates to the previous point on trust, and perhaps looking at it through a different angle, in the sense that there was trust on behalf of those that abstained, that the regional and the sub-regional actors would know best what should happen in the region, right? Because I mean, that's something that came up in the interviews I had with Brazilian diplomats. You know, the Arab League were calling for a no-fly zone, establishing a no-fly zone, and Brazil in particular. I mean, not to simply just talk about Brazil, but they were the president of the UN Security Council back in February, and that's the argument they used. You know, they were supportive of invoking the responsibility to protect and referring to military means in a Security Council resolution following Arab League's support for establishing a no-fly zone. But they did say they abstained because they were really concerned about that one operative paragraph 4 in the resolution, which included the all necessary means provision. So just in terms of looking at issues of trust, in the sense of trusting what the regional, sub-regional organization had to say initially in this regard.
Cool. Thanks, Cristina. Any of the presenters want to comment on that? There's also a question in the chat as well. So I don't know if Nick, Adrian, any of the panelists want to respond to Cristina at all? Or to Jason's comment as well in the chat.
I've just read Jason's comment in the chat. Sorry, it's Adrian. So yes, I know, unfortunately, Jason had to join the presentation late and missed our paper, but we did say in the presentation, Jason, that we agree with the paper you make reference to with regards to you and Jess Gifkins in terms of your interpretation of post-authorisation Libya. I would just say with regards to South Africa, to go back to our point on face-to-face interactions and trust, on 3 occasions the questions were raised by South African representatives regarding the implementation of the mandate. And on 3 occasions, they had no answers given. There was just silence, essentially. Now, if you have voted in favour of a resolution authorising the use of force in Libya, and then you ask questions about the implementation of that, to go back to trust, surely you would expect to have those answers and a deliberation. And if they just sit there in silence and don't answer the questions, then that, you could imagine, would undermine your perception of their integrity.
Cheers, Adrian. Thank you. James, you got a comment or a question? Or
I have a question for Jennifer, actually, if no one else has got any questions. So, am I right to go ahead?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, so Jennifer, at the end, you suggested that you might have you were going to look at some potential alternatives to the UN Security Council, but you weren't very clear on what you actually thought was going to be the best option. Do you have any sense of, you mentioned UN parliaments, increasing the parliamentary representativeness, decreasing the power of the UN Security Council authorization? Do you think any of these are actually really foreseeable, really actually could be developed as good options? So I haven't worded that very well.
No, it's a great question. And of course, all of us who work in this area always face, as was the case with the discussion on the veto, why do you discuss these things when there's no way that they are politically possible, right? And so I'll answer it in 2 parts. One is, and I could be wrong on this, but we'll see, that I actually think the COVID period and the increasing irrelevance and frustration with the council and the degree to which it has literally become a forum for Sino-US politics may provide an opening for some change. I mean, when you go back and look at the instances in which Uniting for Peace has been used, depending on your count, it's around 12 or 13 times, right? Which is more than I think many people realize. The vast majority of those instances are when the Security Council asks the General Assembly to consider a situation. It's not the General Assembly taking the initiative. And so you have groups of states who ask the GA to consider a particular issue. And I actually think this is something we could see. I mean, one of the reasons why Uniting for Peace was marginalized, well, there's 2 reasons, I think. One is that it increasingly became less about an avenue for reform and more a way for non-aligned states, and particularly Arab states, to raise the issue of Israel's policy in the occupied territories and US support for Israel's policy. So that's where more recent emergency special sessions in the 2000s, that's what they were held on, right? And also because the Security Council was more united in the 2000s, it was reasserting its primary role in international peace and security. And I think we're in a different world. I think we're now in a moment where this can be rethought. So if you take the incidents of the IIIM, where you had the GA actually taking the initiative to create that mechanism, you also have some combination of GA members forcing, through a procedural mechanism, discussion of North Korea on the council's agenda when it couldn't be put on the council's agenda by the permanent members. There was too much division. You begin to see a potential, rebalancing. But there still is the obvious fact that, the GA is, a very complex body to get something done. So my view on this, but I'm still really thinking about it kind of as I finalize the paper, is that some combination, which would require diplomatic initiative on the part of a group of states that want to do this, to reassess the balance between the council and the GA again, and a live discussion about a UN Parliamentary Assembly. I mean, there is such a thing in the EU. We have an EU Parliament. We can talk about where it's effective and where it isn't. But if you have a body that's operating by parliamentary procedures rather than by GA procedures, it can be an alternative body for proposing policy. And again, these are political mechanisms. But I want to explore that in the paper. I think a combination of those two things. And then thirdly, and I think this is where actually ICAS was conservative, I think, and this goes to something Cristina said, sorry I'm talking so long, I'll finish really quickly. I think thirdly, an evolution towards where regional bodies, regional collective security bodies, take a more preeminent role even prior to council authorization, may be what we'll see. So ICAS said they can't act until they have council authorization. But, you had instances in the early 90s where they did, and the council gave their post facto authorization. I think we'll see regional bodies potentially pushing at that mechanism as well. I don't know if I'm going to have the space to talk about it in the paper. I think there is room for an interesting paper that looks at regional arrangements again. So I may leave that out, and I may just talk about the GA, the Parliamentary Assembly idea, and the balance of power between the council and the GA. So I don't know if that answers you entirely, but it's a start.
Thanks, Jennifer. Nick, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Jennifer, can I just come in on that? I think that's a fascinating set of issues you're raising about the relationship between the GA and the council. And you made the point about, the council becoming increasingly divided between the US and China. But what impact do you think, in general, the COVID crisis is going to have if the UN organs find themselves increasingly having to work virtually? Because if the UN General Assembly is going to be, as I understand it, held completely virtually in terms of the speeches and the statements, and I think it raises some really interesting questions about what diplomacy is going to look like. But these Adrian was talking about the face-to-face dimension and the failure to kind of pick that up in the Libyan crisis, and whether that might have made a difference in terms of maintaining trustworthiness. But what are the possibilities for the kind of things you're talking about if those things take place increasingly in virtual spaces? I mean, we all hope, obviously, there'll be a vaccine and we'll be able to return to, the world that we had before in some ways, although, I'm sure there are lots of things that we would probably want to take away from this experience as well, but that's another conversation. But, I mean, how do you think it might impact those questions that you're talking about?
Yeah, am I still on? Oh, I'm not on mute. I haven't thought about it enough. But I have two thoughts about this that might be helpful. One is I do think it will have an impact. I think if if we continue to go virtual, the GA will become even more formalistic. And it may give space to a couple of other dynamics. And I'm just speculating here. But one is this trend, potential trend, that Scott Shapiro and Una Hathaway have recently talked about, is about these kind of club diplomacy, where you create groupings of states around particular issues that engage intensively. And they keep outside spoilers, but they're really trying to engage. And this is a form of plurilateralism, whatever you want to call, but it's state cooperation outside of traditional multilateral structures. And we may see more of that. And secondly, added to this, I mean, some of the work I've been doing over the last month has been re-looking at options for Canadian foreign policy as a kind of traditional supporter of multilateralism. Where, what are Canada's options at the moment? And, given that ICUS was a kind of Canadian sponsored idea, Canada, like Australia and many others, is palpably caught in the middle of the US and China. I mean, so much so that it's had 2 of its citizens in jail for over 500 days, detained in China in a tit for tat. So we are right in the middle. And some would say, we dodged a bullet not getting a Security Council seat, because had we gotten it, we would have had to take public stances that alienated both the US and China at a time when we don't want to do that, right? But, Canada is actively asking itself whether it should be a system maintainer or a radical system innovator. And if it's the latter, it may do the minimum within a context like the GA and really begin to explore alternatives like the Alliance for Multilateralists, other cooperative arrangements. I haven't thought enough about what this means for RtoP, but, I think these are really interesting questions to begin, to ask. It doesn't answer your question about virtual, because they still have to operate virtually, but I think it's part of it.
Thanks, Jennifer. Richard, I think you've had your hand up for a while. Go for it. Richard, are you still on?
Apologies. I was unmuted on Zoom, but I was muted on my actual mic. Question for Adrian and Nick. How much does trust actually matter then? I'm just thinking here in terms of, are Russian and Chinese vetoes merely using kind of trust-based arguments that the P3 can't be trusted, just to kind of cloak their own self-interest? So if we go back to early vetoes over Syria, even when very clear assurances were made that the use of force wouldn't be used, we still had vetoes cast over statements of condemnation and humanitarian access. So it makes me wonder, if there's a clash of P5 interests, how does trust matter anyway? And then conversely, in cases where there perhaps isn't any clash of interests between the P5, does trust matter at all there? Because if the P5 have no clash of interest, then there's no reason to veto anyway. Does trust matter? Cheers.
Nick, Adrian, do you want to respond to that at all? Question of trust.
So we touched on this yesterday with Justin. So just to clarify, we definitely think interests matter a lot, and we don't want to give the false impression that we don't think that interests matter. But I guess and that's why in the conclusion, we are saying that trust is an enabling condition, and essentially is a very important enabling condition. Because, for example, even if you could hypothesize that in the future, even if you had all the factors that were there over Libya, if the P5 distrust one another, then and it may be that distrust that leads to the veto. So let's just say there are no great power interests, but that they distrust one another in the P5, it could be that distrust of the others that leads to the veto. So we're not trying to suggest that interests don't matter. I can't remember Richard's two different things at the end, but just to be clear on that issue, thanks.
Yeah, I think the point is that there has to be a situation where no member of the P5 is willing to cast a veto because they believe they've got vital interests at stake. And that goes back, of course, to the ICISS proposal that the veto shouldn't be cast in situations where the P5 don't have vital interests at stake, but it accepted that where they have vital interests at stake, then they understood that that would be a different context. So in the case of Kosovo, Russia threatened to cast the veto. No resolution was tabled before the council because they believed they had vital interests at stake in the conflict. So in a sense, one of the enabling conditions for Pillar 3 authorization is that there must be that situation where the P5 are not in that situation of distrust. And what makes Libya so interesting, we argue, is that the P2 found themselves in that neutral state where there was neither trust nor distrust. Now, in the current context of the council, it's hard to see that situation developing because of the reasons that Jennifer and others have said. And that maybe makes Libya, we have to think about that in the longer term, whether Libya is an exceptional case. I mean, certainly there was a constellation of forces that came together, but it's not just those contextual factors that people normally cite. It's also this balance between the dynamics of trust, neutrality, and then only in the implementation phase do you see the shift to distrust. And even then, it's not right across the council. It's still it's a relatively small number of states. And the question of how far Libya impacted on Syria, I think, is a fascinating one, because clearly the ability of Russia and the United States to work together over Syria was massively compromised by the Russian fear as to what the Western states might do with enabling resolutions. If you go back to Resolution 2118, for example, fascinating moment where the Security Council finds the Syrian use of chemical weapons as a threat to international peace and security. Maybe there's a moment there where there could have been a different story in terms of US-Russian cooperation, but the Russians are extremely nervous and sensitive because of what's happened over both, Kosovo, Iraq, and Libya, of course. So I think trust is a really important factor in this story. It's by no means the only factor. And of course, there could be situations where states fundamentally disagree, as Adrian says, even if they trust one another. I mean, we've got to be careful going too far the other way. But I do think trust opens up things that we haven't seen so much before and gives us a different way of thinking about these questions. Thanks.
Brilliant, thanks, Nick. I'm actually going to have to sort of draw things to a close. I've just looked at Jess's Jess Gifkins has just contributed something on chat about how those kind of corridor coffee shop meetings are often really important in UN Security Council diplomacy. And I guess the same could be said as that time when you go for a beer or a bite to eat after an academic panel or a conference is really important for academia. Unfortunately, we can't do that, and I hope soon we'll find a vaccine and we'll be able to do that once again. I'd like to just thank all participants, all the presenters and all the participants listening for joining us in a new format in a very weird time.